Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. For watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today we'll be heading over to the Mid-American Conference for some MACtion and taking a look at the Western Michigan Broncos, who finished 6-7 last season and capped off their season with an appearance in the Salute to the Veterans Bowl. They wrapped up their 2025 spring practice with their spring showcase on April 12th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is a professional basketball watcher. He is a ball knower. He is a contributor for Busting Brackets. He is the sports editor for the WMU Western Herald. He is Joseph Hartzell. Joseph can be found on X at J_Hart32. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Excited to talk about Western Michigan. You know, not a ton of coverage out there on the Broncos, so it's great to see what you guys are doing at the G5 Hive. You know, getting some coverage on schools like Western who don't get that national love.
Well, before we get to all the love, we need to know a little bit more about you, Joseph. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What got you interested in sports media and journalism, and how long you've been covering Western Michigan football?
Yeah, so I got into sports journalism about 2 years ago. I switched majors. I went into college originally thinking I wanted to be an engineering major. I played several sports throughout high school and middle school, and all the way back. And I've always loved sports, and I've always wanted to work in sports. And after engineering really I realized it wasn't my thing. I switched into the sports journalism world, and I joined the Western Herald, and I've been covering Western Michigan ever since. I've been in the sports room ever since, so it's been great.
Well, let's move over to some Western Michigan football, and let's start with the offense. For those not familiar with Western Michigan's offensive style, how would you describe it?
It's super running heavy, and it focuses on the running backs even more. Lance Taylor has that pedigree with running backs, being with guys like Christian McCaffrey, and you saw that last year with kind of a three-headed monster. You saw Zahir Abdus-Salam, Jaden Nixon, and Jalen Buckley, and Buckley really didn't quite have the year that everyone was expecting, but it almost wasn't even really a knock on him, because it was just how good Jaden Nixon was. It was hard to not get him the ball as much as possible, and you see that he's going to go play a huge role with Scott Frost and UCF down there in Florida. And I think that that's really the big focus of Lance Taylor's offense, is that he wants to get the ball to his running backs. He wants playmakers at the running back spot, and he wants to get them the ball in space. And that's what you see a lot.
Let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. The Broncos will look to find their QB1 this offseason, as Hayden Wolf has graduated. Brock Lowry returns in 2025, as well as Mark Konecki, Mason Reynolds, and Larry Robinson. The staff also brought in Brady Jones from Riverside Community College. I feel like this is a real quarterback competition this summer. What can you tell us about what you saw or heard in this room this spring?
Yeah, I think it's likely going to come down to Lowry and Brady Jones. Jones is that dual threat guy coming out of Riverside Community College, I believe is where he's from. And Brock Lowry is probably the best returning quarterback. You saw him get some snaps here and there, especially in short yardage situations or obvious running downs. They made a point to get him on the field, and I think that's because he is a good ball carrier. If you have to look at who has a certain skill, Brock Lowry does have the ability to carry the ball and be a dual threat quarterback, which I think really plays into Lance Taylor wanting to run the ball, and also how much Lance Taylor, he really looks for continuity. That was a big theme last offseason too, is, we weren't where we wanted to be in year one. Let's get some continuity. We can install, more complex schemes. We can really focus on guys we're bringing back and improving. And I think you're going to see more of that in year three. You saw a slight improvement in the record, 6-6, but it was really kind of a rough end of the season after a really hot start, I felt like.
Well, you talked about Lowry's game. The staff brought in Brady Jones. You say this, could come down to him. Can you describe his game to us a little bit?
he's another dual threat guy. These are both guys who are able to use their legs. And I think that that's going to be a little bit of change after Hayden Wolf, who, for lack of a better term, unfortunately, he just was not the most mobile quarterback in the world. He had a lot of great things about him. He was a high completion percentage guy, didn't make a ton of stupid throws, but he did not move particularly well out of the pocket. And I think that that'll be a big change for opponents when they see Western this year, is that you will now likely have to deal with the quarterback's legs.
Now, Lowry returns. Do you think that gives him a leg up? Or if you had to guess who starts week 1 against Michigan State, who would you pick, and where would you rate that confidence level on a scale of 1 to 10?
I do think Lowry will end up starting, especially early in the year, just with that continuity, the familiarity with the system, but a very low confidence, probably a 3 or 4, just because, Brady Jones is an experienced guy. I mean, he's got several years under his belt. He's played a lot of football. So he's not going to be a guy that's just immediately going to roll over and not be the starting quarterback. I think, it really will be a competition. I don't think anybody really should be a heavy favorite to start game 1.
Well, moving over to the running game, Jaden Nixon sure made his presence felt in 2024 as he was a first-team all-conference player. He is now, like you mentioned earlier, off to UCF. Zahir Abdul-Salam and Keyshawn King have graduated. Jalen Buckley battled injuries in 2024, but when he was able to play, he was still pretty effective. And I got to think maybe some fans were maybe a little bit disappointed just based on what we saw from Jalen in 2023, but, they kind of had that two-headed monster there. And Jalen still had 9 touchdowns and 688 yards last year. With these losses, the Broncos will be looking to replace 264 rushing attempts, 1,552 yards, and 15 touchdowns. A notable name the staff added via the portal was Michigan running back Cole Cabana. What are your expectations in this room as we head into 2025?
I think you'll see another two-headed monster. I think Cole Cabana is that's a big add for Western. Anytime you can get guys with his recruiting pedigree in the building is a win for a school like Western. To be able to get a Power 5 level athlete in the MAC, and I think that's why you'll see kind of a two-headed monster with him and also Jalen Buckley. I think that as disappointing as the numbers may have looked to some fans, I think you kind of have to take into account just how good Jaden Nixon really was. I mean, he had games where he was just incredible. He was truly a Power 5 level running back. I mean, you saw that over at Oklahoma State. He just didn't quite get the reps, especially with Ollie Gordon in the building. And he went down a level to the MAC and came on to Western Michigan really, really strong and was one of the best running backs in the MAC.
Do you know what was ailing Buckley last season, and did he look healthy this spring?
I think for the most part he's healthy. I think it was just some nagging stuff that every football player deals with for the most part. That combined with not really needing to force him the ball a lot, really kind of combined to take away from some carries.
With that two-headed monster, do you think it's going to be a 50-50 split? Do you think it's going to be 60-40, or what do you think between Cabana and Jalen?
I could see 60-40. I think Buckley ends up getting a few more carries, but honestly, I think it'll be splitting hairs when it gets down to it. I think both guys will have tons of touches. I really think those are going to be the two guys that Western wants to get the ball to the most this year, especially with all the wide receiver talent that left last year. I think those two are really the guys that I'll look to get the ball to.
Can you tell our listeners that maybe not as familiar a little bit about maybe the skill sets that Jalen Buckley and Cole Cabana bring to the table for the Broncos?
Yeah, Buckley's a really great between the tackles guy. I think he has really strong vision. That's a really underrated part of his game. And he has a little bit of build to him. He's got a little bit of strength to him. He runs through those arm tackles, and you saw that really succeed with the interior offensive line with Addison West and Jacob Gideon last year. It's unfortunate to lose guys like that, but them allowing him to get to the second level, I think did a lot of things for him and Jaden Nixon, who had the big year. Is part of that was having two awesome interior offensive linemen who could play right next to each other. And so those arm tackles in the secondary, when he gets to the second level, I think he's a real problem to handle.
How would you describe the skill set that Cole Cabana brings to the table?
I think it's pretty similar. I think he's a good route runner as well. I think you could see a lot of Cabana in the passing game, kind of that Zahir Abdus-Salam role the year before almost, when he was a little bit of a bigger piece in the offense before Jaden Nixon got there, catching the ball in the backfield. I think he'll be a real threat.
If you had to take a guess who gets that first handoff for running back in 2025 against Michigan State, who would that be?
I think it'll be Jalen Buckley. I think they'll really rely on him to be more of a between the tackles guy and kind of wear down the defense and allow Cabana to be more of a big hitter home run type. And I think that could pay off dividends for both those guys. I think you'll see probably slightly more carries for Buckley, but similar yardage and similar touches, especially with Cabana getting the ball in the backfield in the passing game.
Well, let's move over to the wide receiving room. And you were talking about all the guys that left. The Broncos graduated their top 2 receivers from a season ago, Kenneth Womack and Anthony Sambucci. The room also sees 6 others hit the portal. That means Malik Diodune will be the top receiver returning in 2025 from the 2024 team. In 2024, he just had 26 targets. The staff also added 4 transfers. The 4 transfers combined for 42 receptions, and actually Egypt Nelson, who isn't on campus yet, is coming in from Virginia Military Institute. He has had more receiving yards, 269, and touchdowns, 1, that which is more than the other 3 incoming transfers combined. So this room may lack the experience, but there are opportunities for someone to pop here in this room. I mentioned all those guys that left. That means 142 targets, 1,227 yards, and 6 touchdowns are up for grabs this season. What are the expectations for this room heading into the season?
I think, from an outside perspective, they're fairly low, but I think my hope and my expectation for this room to really blossom is leaning on the running game and kind of allowing that running game to open things up downfield. While you don't bring a ton back in the receiving room, you do have a really awesome tight end, I think, in Blake Bosma, who's one of the better tight ends in the MAC. And I think leaning on him and a guy like Dudon, who's pretty good, he's been solid. He's had flashes in his career here at Western, and I think he's got pretty good size too, which should really kind of open things up for him downfield. I would say that if you're looking for one guy to pop, it's probably either Dudon or Christian Leary, the transfer from Georgia Tech. Just another guy who I think really follows the trend that Lance Taylor set of trying to get Power 5 level athletes in the building and Power 5 level size in the building, and he's one of those guys who has that.
Well, Sambucci and Womack accounted for 62.5% of the Broncos' wide receiving targets in 2024. How do you see those vacated targets being distributed here in 2025?
Well, I think Blake Bosma will certainly see his fair share of targets. He will likely lead the team in targets if it's not if one of the wide receivers doesn't kind of blossom into a true wide receiver 1. Otherwise, I could really see Christian Leary kind of being that guy that really gets a large majority of the targets, or Malik Dudon with the familiarity of the offense and the continuity aspect that he brings back. I think those guys, along with Talik Williams, are probably the 2 or probably the 3 guys who you see the large majority of snaps going to. But I think really this offense will go as the running game goes.
Well, you've talked a lot about Blake Bosma. So for fans that may not be so familiar with Western, can you describe how the tight ends are utilized in this offense?
These guys are used as, I would say, aggressive safety valves. They're not going to be 25 yards downfield looking for big plays. They're good route runners typically, got good hands. Bosma's a guy who can go over the middle, hold on to the ball through contact. He's going to find a way to get open. They're great against zone coverage, and I really think they're just consistent and hard-nosed football players. A lot of the times Western Michigan tight ends can block, especially in Lance Taylor's offenses, with his reliance on the running game. So these guys are really kind of dual threat tight ends in the sense that they're both good blockers and they've got good hands that can be threats downfield in the passing game.
Other than Bosma, and they brought in a couple transfers, and to me, it almost looks like maybe they're going to run 2 tight end sets more often than we've seen in the past. But did any of the other tight ends stand out to you in the spring?
I didn't have any names in the spring that really particularly stood out to me in the tight end room outside of Bosma. I think that he's really going to be the moneymaker. He's going to be the flashy name that gets all the targets. If you do see a guy step up, it's going to be someone who really shows, I think, on the blocking side of things that they are capable of being that, more of a force in the running game.
Well, heading into 2024, the Broncos were looking to figure out the left side of their line as the left tackle and left guard graduate. In 2025, the line loses all of their starters except left guard in John Hoffer. The guys who replace them don't have a start under their belt, so it'll be a tough task for them, and it'll be a tough task for this room to replace first-team all-conference right guard Addison West and first-team all-conference center in Jacob Gideon. They added 3 P4 guys to help bolster this room, but the Wake Forest, Michigan, and Illinois transfers have only combined for 47 snaps to their name. What are the expectations for this offensive line heading into 2025?
I think the biggest thing I'm looking for is to see them kind of gel, and hopefully that Power 5 size, that Power 4 size, really kind of allows them to dominate MAC competition. That's one of the things that I think that can't be understated enough is how intentional that Western was in bringing in Power 4 capable bodies. These are guys who were recruited to play Power 4 snaps. And while it may not have worked out at their prior destination, a guy like Hunter Whitenack, who was at Illinois, that Illinois is a top 15 team next year. It's really tough to get reps on a team like that, and going down a level can, I think, do a lot of wonders for these guys. Raheem Anderson has a little bit of wherewithal with Cole Cabana coming in, 2 guys both coming from that Michigan program. I just think that it'll really rely on these guys gelling, and it's going to be tough to replace a guy like Addison West, he was an All-American. He was one of the best offensive guards in the entire country last year, regardless of level. So losing a guy like that is always going to be a big deal. And then losing another guy in 5th-year senior Jacob Gideon, who was all conference and the center, the kind of captain of that offensive line, that's a tough task to replace. And the biggest thing that's replacing is the kind of gel and chemistry that offensive line had last year. And I think that'll be a big thing to watch. And that's really what the offensive line is relying on to boom.
Well, if this O-line just kills it this year, they just step up and they dominate, they own that offensive line and able to run it really well, protect really well, it's because who stepped up big in this room?
I think it's because Raheem Anderson stepped up. I think, him being the center, he's going to have to kind of be the captain and pull guys in to create that chemistry that a lot of transfer offensive lines have lacked in the transfer portal era, where you see teams kind of patchworking offensive lines with guys who have never played together before. That'll be huge. And that kind of all starts with the guy who snaps the ball, which is going to be Raheem Anderson. And if he can really be a dominant force in the middle and anchor things both in the locker room and on the field, that'll be the reason that really drives Western Michigan's offensive line this year.
If you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
I think Jalen Buckley is probably my best answer. He's going to have the ball in his hands the most. I expect him to lead the team in touches. And if it's not Buckley, it's probably Brock Lowry, I think, who kind of explodes onto the scene as more than a runner. The potential is really there if the arm is ready. I think that if he shows the capability of throwing the ball downfield, really at all to a dangerous extent, you really have a kind of dual threat offense that teams in the MAC aren't really used to, in the sense that you can stretch the ball downfield and also beat teams between the tackles. And I think that offensive line will be a big factor in that. And there's not really one specific guy that I can pinpoint on the offensive line. The offensive line is good and creates holes for the running game and gives Lowry time. I think that this offense has a lot of potential.
Well, Joseph, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. And Western Michigan's going to have a new defensive coordinator in 2025. Chris O'Leary joins the staff. He spent 2024 as a safeties coach for the LA Chargers. Prior to that, he was with Notre Dame for 6 seasons. During his time there, he served as defensive analyst, defensive grad assistant, DB safety coach. What can you tell us about Coach O'Leary and what he brings to the table for the Broncos?
He's got a strong background in the defensive backfield, which I think is big for Western Michigan. You've seen recently they've had several good pass rushers, with probably the best of them being Marshawn Nealand, who got taken in the second round by the Cowboys a couple years ago. And I think really last year what I looked at it as is, even though you had a couple of good individual pieces, that secondary really struggled at times. Whether it was supporting the run game or really not being able to cover guys in the passing game. That secondary, there were a lot of blown coverages. And I think that bringing a guy with the pedigree in the secondary like Chris O'Leary is huge. I mean, he coached guys like Derwin James, and Notre Dame has had stellar defenses his entire time he was there. And a big reason for that was how good the secondaries have been at Notre Dame. Coaching guys like Xavier Watts and I'm blanking.
Kyle Hamilton.
Yeah, Kyle Hamilton, the safety for the Baltimore Ravens. Guys like that, him having that pedigree, I think, will be huge for Western and really building into that secondary a little bit.
Well, has there been any talk about what kind of defensive scheme Coach O'Leary will run? Because being with the LA Chargers and being in these different spots as a DB coach and a safeties coach, he hasn't really had the opportunity to put his fingerprints on a defense. And what are you hearing there in Kalamazoo?
I think you'll likely see a lot of 4-3. That's what Jim Harbaugh likes to run, and I also think that with his defensive back kind of background, you'll see some nickel and dime a little bit more than you have in the past. I think just because he has a propensity to lean on, he trusts his defensive backs, he coaches his defensive backs. But the thing that concerns me the most with that is just I think this cornerback room is really thin. And especially with Joseph Jefferson leaving in the spring, the second window to go to Louisville, I think that was a huge loss. That was a Power 5 guy coming from Purdue. And I think that was a big loss, unfortunately. And so I'll be interested to see how much nickel and dime he goes to, but I think you'll see a heavy dose of 4-3, just kind of playing off of what he learned from being under Jim Harbaugh for a year, really.
Well, let's dig into the position groups on this defense. Let's start with the guys up front along that defensive line. While the room does not lose any players to graduation, it does see 7 guys transfer. That results in 11 of the 13 sacks from 2024 now being gone. What are the expectations for this defensive line as we head into the 2025 season?
I'm hoping to see some guys like Popeye Williams, kind of pop in year 2. That's a guy who I think had some real potential but didn't really land all the way last year. He was, kind of on and off the field a little bit and had some consistency issues. And I think that my hope is really that and my expectation is that, he kind of becomes a more consistent pass rusher. I think he has the highest potential of anybody on this defensive line. Excuse me. And I think that he could really be the driving force and kind of an example for a lot of the guys on the defensive line to really, get pressure on the quarterback again, like we didn't really see last year.
Was there any, Popeye's on the edge? Is there any of the interior guys you're kind of excited to see here in 2025?
I think the dangerous thing is the defensive tackle room is really thin. It's probably guys like Dorian Wesley and Dakari Frazier who are the two that I would look at in the middle from Alabama A&M and Ball State that probably are going to be the two that get the most snaps. But honestly, I think that the highest expectation you can really have for those guys is that they're productive, kind of plug up the middle and just, be solid, don't get rolled over. Don't just don't get the ball ran down your throat, down the middle every play, really take up some offensive alignment from the opposing team and kind of let your edge guys who have a little bit more talent, go to work and hopefully get home on the quarterback a little bit more often.
Well, linebackers will lack some experience as the team loses both starters, Donald Willis and Jacob Wahlberg, to graduation. Willis led the team in tackles with 93. The next closest on the team was 57. Bonema was a rotational guy, and he's also graduated. Dominic Moon, who played in 5 games, averaged 22 snaps per game, will be the most experienced guy from this 2024 room coming back in 2025. Did anybody stand out in the spring?
I think Dominic Moon is probably going to be the best linebacker of the group. He's a guy with really good size for the MAC. That's kind of been a theme here. I feel like in our conversation is the guys that they are focusing on do have really good size and really good athleticism, and I think he's a guy that could be a really productive tackler. I think he's great in the run game, and the real question mark with him is how he handles the passing game. But I really think he's going to be a productive linebacker. You really see Western has had productive linebackers in the past, even last year when the defense was not great. Donald Willis still had a very productive year there at the middle linebacker spot. I just kind of think that Dominic Moon will be that guy who kind of figures it out almost and kind of leads that defense.
So if Dominic Moon leads the defense, is he the rah guy in the locker room that leads this team, or is there another guy in the room that does that?
I wouldn't say I wouldn't say I particularly have a certain guy who's really the biggest upbeat guy. I think it's a lot of guys are pretty upbeat on the defensive side of the ball. A guy like Tate Halleck is really, I think, the main leader in the locker room. That's a guy who's played a lot of football for Western Michigan, and he was really good last year. He was one of the better defensive backs, I think, in the MAC, personally. I don't think he got a ton of love, and probably because of the team success, but him and Bilal Kone were both awesome pieces in the secondary last year, and you saw some struggles elsewhere in the other corners. But I think Tate Halleck is really that guy who leads from the locker room.
Well, moving over to that secondary, that room saw 8 guys hit the portal. They also lose both starting corners in Bilal Kone, who's off to the NFL, and Naquan Washington, and as well as Tashawn Bussell, who's gone to graduation. Safety Damari Robinson also graduates, but not all is lost. You have to feel pretty good about the top 2 safeties returning, and Tate Halleck and Aaron Wolford being back in 2025. Halleck led the team in interceptions with 4, and we talked about Donald Willis kind of leading the team in tackles with 93, and that being the highest. Tate Halleck, like you mentioned earlier, was number 2 with 57. What did this obviously having those 2 safeties is great, but at the cornerback room, what did the staff kind of do to address those losses?
I think a big one was Joseph Jefferson. He would have been a massive piece, I think, and that was a really unfortunate departure in the spring. But the corner I'm most excited for is Jordan Thomas out of Eastern Kentucky, and he's played a lot of football. Originally starting at Wingate, ending up at Eastern Kentucky, and he was really productive last year. He broke up 14 passes. He was strong in the run game. He was just a really, really good defensive playmaker. I felt like he was solid on both sides, really, of the defensive end. And I think that's a guy that really will need to be the cornerback one, kind of take the lead receiver, and then really rely on that experience at the safety spot. Tate Halleck is one of those guys. He's really turned into a defensive playmaker. He's all over the field. He's a guy with great range in the passing game. You mentioned those 4 interceptions. He's really opportune on bad throws. And Aaron Wofford just kind of being that secondary safety. He has the continuity. He knows how to play off of Tate Halleck a little bit. And I think having those guys on the back end really allows the corners to kind of play a little more aggressively. And that's where you'll see a guy like Jordan Thomas really kind of excel in being able to be aggressive, being able to hunt the ball a little bit, because, he does have those guys over the top in Tate Halleck and Wofford to really break stuff up behind him.
Do you think maybe with the inexperience at linebacker that Halleck might even be, do more in terms of tackling than he did a year ago?
Yeah, I think Tate Halleck will really be the leader in the statistical department as much as he is the locker room. That's a guy who he showed a real ability last year in coming down to play the run game a little bit, and it really didn't take away from his passing defense either. So I think that he's a guy you could see start to creep up into the box, especially on those running downs, and really be a force kind of all over the field.
Is there you got the experience at safety, but is there maybe a lesser known guy, a younger guy, or someone that you think can really step up here in 2025?
I don't have a younger guy particularly. I think Jordan Thomas, though, I'm just going to reiterate that name. I think he's been awesome at Eastern Kentucky, which is a lower level, obviously, than Western Michigan. He's going up a level. But I think he showed a lot last year, and I think he's fully capable of being a lead defensive back in the MAC. I think he's got the ability to do that, and I think he's got the ability to be a defensive playmaker and really, create a lot of opportunities for this Western Michigan defense to be a solid defense in the MAC.
All right, Joseph, we've talked about the defensive line. We've talked about the linebackers, the secondary. If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who you got?
I think it's Popeye Williams. I think that's a guy who has a lot of physical talent, and it didn't, he came from Louisville. He had some consistency issues last year. I think that if the year two jump really happens, I think you have a really studly defensive end and a defensive line that missed that last year, and from a program that isn't, kind of been known for their pass rush over the years. Hasn't always had the greatest defenses, but the pass rush has been there. You talk about Marshawn Kneeland, but you also have guys like Brandon Fisk who ended up at Florida State. And I just think that Popeye Williams could really be that guy that causes havoc and also kind of has the flashy highlight sacks and the big numbers.
Well, we've talked offense, we've talked defense. Now let's move over to the special teams. How are those units looking, and are there any concerns?
I don't have any concerns. Bring back Palmer Domschke for another year, who I think has been solid. This is a guy who, he's pretty consistent. I have a lot of faith in him as a place kicker, and I think that, Western special teams, it's a well-coached football team. It's Lance Taylor's a good coach. I think with guys like that, the special teams are rarely an issue.
All right. Well, now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into the 2025 season?
I think the most concerning group is that cornerback room. Outside of Jordan Thomas, I really don't have another name that really stands out to me as a guy who I think will be capable of being a stopper. And I think that really if any of those guys that are kind of in the background right now at that position, it can hold up. That's really where the floor raises is in that cornerback room. Is one of those guys stepping up and being a second corner that Chris O'Leary can really rely on to be in the secondary. And I think you could end up with a pretty solid secondary here in Kalamazoo if that happens. But until I see that, it's a real concern to me.
In today's age of NIL, revenue sharing, and the transfer portal, how have you seen it change the Broncos' recruiting philosophy?
Well, I think you've seen, kind of bringing in a lot of transfers. This is a guy in Lance Taylor who really likes going after some of these Power 4 guys who don't work out at other schools. And I think you see some real success rates in guys like, Jaden Nixon, who came from Oklahoma State, had some flashes there, but it never really quite worked out. But that's a Power 4 level athlete. It's a Power 4 level body. And he came in and shined at the MAC level. And I think you've really seen Western kind of play into this idea of we can get guys who are athletically good enough to be at the Power 4 level. And those guys can have a lot of success in the MAC. A lot of teams in the MAC don't have that size, don't have that speed. So getting that size and speed in the building is massive.
How do you feel that the staff at Western Michigan is doing navigating the portal?
I think they're doing a great job. One of the biggest things I point to is bringing a guy like Jalen Buckley back. Not once but twice. They were able to keep Marshawn Kneeland in the building for his last year in a Western Michigan uniform. These are guys who really get a lot of buy-in to this program. They're kind of selling guys on, the grass isn't always greener. There's a lot of opportunities for guys to go elsewhere, I'm sure. And, that's just the nature of the portal. But being able to keep a lot of those guys, being able to keep Addison West, being able to keep Jacob Gideon. I mean, Addison West was an All-American last year. Like, that's a guy who probably could have been one of the best offensive linemen in any of the power conferences last year. And he was able to stay in a Western Michigan uniform and just getting that buy-in to the community, getting that buy-in to the school, that kind of loyalty aspect. There's more than money when you have to look at your situation. Do you want to go to the NFL? Opportunity matters. Being able to show what you can do matters. Like Western has shown that we're capable of putting guys in the NFL, getting guys taken in top 2 rounds. I mean, Marshawn Kneeland went in the 2nd round. So it's not impossible to achieve the NFL from Western Michigan. I think that's been huge.
What do you think the main strength of this 2025 team will be?
The running game. That's kind of the theme with all Lance Taylor teams. The team will go as the running game goes. Last year, Western Michigan really relied on that running game to win a lot of games. I believe there was a stat. It was like Western Michigan was 5-1 when they ran for 195 or more yards, 0-6 when they were at less than that. And so I think that, the running back room has the most talent out of any of the position groups, and that'll be, really the biggest reliance on whether or not Western Michigan will really be good or not.
All right, Joseph, if Western Michigan is going to be good or not is the question. What does success look like for the Broncos in 2025?
I think improving that record, you really want to be, after last year, especially after that hot start in the MAC, you really want to compete for a MAC championship. That's always the goal, is start in your conference, start at your level, compete for championships in the MAC. That's the standard at Western Michigan, in my opinion. And I think that this team, if it's successful, will be competing for a MAC championship. I circle that September 20th game with Toledo. I believe that's the conference opener. And that kind of leads into a big stretch with UMass and I believe the FCS opponent. I'm blanking on the
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yes. So a big opportunity. Toledo should be, per usual, one of the best teams in the MAC. And so winning that game against Toledo really sets Western up for a big run, and I think a real chance to compete for the MAC, go to the MAC championship.
Well, Joseph, we've covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything else you want to share or think that we should know about this 2025 Western Michigan Broncos football team?
I think you guys have done a good job of covering this, and I'm really excited to see what happens when this team sees Michigan State in week 1. I really circle one game against Illinois as the only game that I really don't see a win happening. Not to say that it couldn't. Obviously, upsets do happen. But I think this team has a much better chance of competing against Michigan State than Illinois. No offense to Michigan State. They just aren't quite on that top 15 team level like Illinois is. And I think if the guys if the transfers in from the Power 4 level and some of the up transfers like Jordan Thomas are able to compete in that game and even keep that game close and really give Michigan State a tough time, I think that bodes well for the rest of the season.
Joseph, thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.